Hello and welcome to this latest community conversation with Minds at Work. One of the aims of this community is to connect people with ideas and ways of working that can help to establish more mentally healthy workplaces. And that's what these conversations are about, introducing the community to leaders, tools and ideas that could prove useful at work. This is being recorded and will be made available in the community library, where you will also find a slew of great conversations and event replays. So please do check out what else is in there. Of course, to really get mental health and wellbeing on the strategic agenda, we need buy-in from business leaders. Yet these leaders are being pulled in all sorts of directions, sometimes caught between old and new ways of working and trying to figure out their place in the post-COVID hybrid working world. So what does it mean to be a leader in the digital age? And how has that changed since the pandemic in a world where increasing numbers of employees demand the flexibility of remote working while businesses want them in the office? Today, I'm excited to welcome Ilona Brannen to our conversation. Ilona is a consultant who works with fast growth tech companies focusing on SaaS scale-ups and sales. She uses her expertise to successfully bring companies into the digital world, focusing on people, processes, and systems to build and scale success at speed. She's also the host of the podcast Still Loading, where she explores the topic of leadership in the digital age. Welcome, Ilona.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Cool. Let's start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, let's talk all about me for a second. Well, a very short intro, but basically I am an elder millennial, which means I'm similar to Gandalf, but with like a digital staff. And so I bridge the two worlds of the analog world and the digital future. And I've been like that since I was wee little one. You know, the first computer rolled into my school, and I remember sitting there in awe, being like, no, and have always been really intrigued with the latest digital technology, but also really passionate about people. So the two combine in my consulting practice, and I look at how to really get the best out of your people for your business, whilst also thinking about that growth, especially with technology or implementing technology or just being digital in this economy. So that's kind of what I do and what I'm passionate about.
Sure. And you say you're fascinated by leadership, especially in this digital age. How so? What is it about the role of the leader that fascinates you?
You know what? I think it came about because I think everyone can relate to having an experience of a poor leader. And I started to realize that people needed help to become better leaders. I really do believe that leadership is a skill that you can practice and develop and become better at. Some of these skills people are better at just naturally because of their experience, but I do think it's a skill set we can all become better at. And when, you know, COVID hit and we all went into a digital world, I saw many leaders floundering at being able to lead their teams in a remote context. And those skill sets become more nuanced and a bit more delicate to manage in a remote context, because you don't have the physical presence of someone next to you, but you can still do great things. And we've seen great examples of great companies doing wonderful things along this pathway, and we've seen people not do great things. And I want there to be better leaders so we can have better workplaces and people can ultimately have better lives.
Sure. And you know, we are, as you say, you're an elder millennial. We're well into the digital age now. Why do you think some managers and businesses in particular find it difficult to transition and incorporate these new ways of working?
Well, I mean, at school, you don't really have this way of working. I mean, I used to be a teacher many years ago, and actually schools are a risk for fire because of so much paper in their buildings. And I think we grow up and sort of experience work. We might be in a digital world, but we're forgetting that we, you know, need people to either be influenced or know and understand a vision and a direction, but we don't necessarily do it in the best possible way, and especially thinking about communicating digitally. So I'll give you an example. If you wanted to have a conversation with a member of your team, we all respond differently to those sorts of invitations. But if someone just dropped an invite into your calendar, your boss, your reaction might be, oh, great, I get to speak to my boss. But equally, your reaction might be like, what have I done? Depending on your personality. And it's getting a leader to understand that that might be a reaction from who they're dealing with. Whereas in the office, your tone, your inflection, all of that would be realized, and you don't get a gist of what's going on. Whereas your brain is going to make up stories depending on how you're feeling with what has just happened to you in this remote world.
I'm definitely one of those who would have gone, oh my God, I'm about to get
What
fired.
have I done? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like racking my brains to try and remember. So in that case, we are working digitally much more. We've gone from fully remote to maybe hybrid these days. What advice do you have based on your experience to those managing or leading teams of people in the modern workforce?
Yeah, it's quite a common question, and I don't think there's like one particular foolproof answer, but I do have a couple of like winning tips that I've seen work really well with clients. So number one is this idea of the convergent and divergent meetings. So when you're setting up meetings in a remote working environment, work out, is this meeting to get agreement on an idea? So that's a convergent meeting. So if that is, who needs to be in it? And if it's a divergent meeting where you need to generate ideas for the next thing, or develop business ideas, whatever it might be, then invite the right people for those sorts of meetings and understand what type of meeting is that. That will mean you reduce sort of meeting fatigue, because we've got way too many meetings on our calendars anyway, and you get more strategic with who you're inviting and what's the reason that they need to be there. So I think just do a little bit of an audit on your meetings at the moment. Is it convergent or divergent? That will help you solve that problem and reduce the amount of sort of wasted times on Zooms that we all have. You don't need everybody in there. You need to be strategic with it. So that's part one. Part two, I would say that you need to have really good ways of internally communicating with each other. So choose your poison, choose your methodology, and stick to it. So if it is that you're going to be using Slack or you're going to be using internal messenger of some description, fantastic, but make sure everybody kind of knows that's where we're communicating. And even if you just sort of maybe set expectations with your team, like let's communicate this way in this community or in this structure, so that messages don't get missed and disparate into the ether. Because I think a lot of the times it's quite common. People won't have seen it, or you could almost see people using it as an excuse to be like, oh, I didn't see that. They might have seen it, but they're using it as an excuse because it's not very clear where the messaging is. And so that accountability or slopey shoulder syndrome becomes like part of the culture. So it's really being clear about where you're communicating, and then knowing everybody has the same responsibility to check where that communications is. And then for leaders, what I've noticed recently with one client, it is about providing the structure and accountability for your team. So in a remote world, working world, it's much more loose and fluid, as you say, because you're hybrid, you work in different time zones, you're working different times of the day. So provide the structure and accountability. So one way I've seen that work incredibly well is one client actually made sure everyone worked on the same document with the key outcomes for the quarter on the same document, and everybody went back to that document, and only one person owned the changes, but everybody knew this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're trying to achieve, and everything went back to that document every quarter. Are we aligning to this goal? Are we aligning to this goal? Are we aligning to this goal? If you don't provide the structure and accountability as a leader, it's going to kind of do this and just kind of dissipate. And that's where I think it can fall down, and then you lose that drive because you need to manufacture that as a leader in a remote context.
Great stuff, Ilona. Thank you for that. You've brought up a few questions for me that I was like, oh, I'll have to ask her this. On the last one, talking about having that accountability, otherwise it'll go all over the place. Yeah. How can leaders get it back if it does start slipping away from them?
I think you have to have a meeting with your team, and you have to almost have a wash up, like, okay, this isn't working. We know it's not working. So what can we do differently? And almost like contract with your team about ways of working. If you start there, kind of go, well, it's not worked, it's okay, but how can we make it work? Because there might be something that works for a quarter or 2 quarters or like a year that works really well, and then it actually has to change because the business has changed or the goals have changed. So recontracting every so often with your team to just check in and be like, does this work, does this not work, is really important. But getting everybody to agree to the ways of working so that you can all work asynchronously and synchronously really, really well, because that's the big gap I'm seeing at the moment. People think, oh, I'll just work and I'll work really hard and I'll work long hours and I'll make sure everything's there, but they're not getting their team to kind of buy in and be like, yeah, I'm going to contribute this is my responsibility and accountability. I've seen way too many leaders burn out because they're carrying everything, and it is about that contracting piece to be like, right, how do we put this all together?
Because you're a team at the end of the day. You might be leading it, but you're not there to do everything. Yeah.
Oh gosh, no. And it's really interesting because there's this concept that's quite strong in the leadership development community, which is around servant leadership. So there's different styles of leadership, and one particular one is called servant leadership. So please go and have a research of that if people feel the need. But essentially, it's that you're there to serve the team, but not in the sense that you do everything for them, but you make sure that they have everything they need in order to be able to obtain and like achieve the objectives that you're trying to like get to together. So if there's blockers, you help unblock them. If they're stuck on something, you help them solve a problem. If they need a piece of equipment, you sort that out. But ultimately, they should be doing what they need to do, so you can all sort of rise in a sort of triangle together. But you're effectively at the bottom, supporting them to get them to the next level.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask something around mental health on this. You mentioned burnout just then. We are a mental health community. And when you were talking about the ways of communicating internally as well, one thing that did come to my mind was obviously everybody has their own preferences. Yes. Particularly, we've done some work with the neurodiverse community within here, and they need to set very strict boundaries around communications as well. How have you seen leaders handle the different needs of a team in a way that still allows that buy-in from everybody for comms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think with leaders, you have to really get to know your teams, because you have to understand what works for different, as you say, people, different neurodivergent needs, but just different communication needs. And I think the delicate balance is understanding how to be able to do that for your team, but also understand the needs of the business. It would be amazing to be able to communicate in every single way, in every single individual way possible. I think it's just understanding, it's a bit like, with websites now, they have accessibility on websites, right? So the content on the website doesn't necessarily change, but being able to ensure accessibility to that website is really important. So I think as a leader, it's making sure the content's there for everyone, but equally removing any barriers to accessible, like to make that content accessible for everyone in the organization. I think that's probably the way to do it.
Sure. And again, you mentioned burnout earlier. So how have you seen leaders protecting their own mental health while trying to protect, support their teams in this journey?
Yeah. So what's fascinating around working remotely with leaders and managers is that managers are often burning out faster and harder in a remote working world. And I've done a bit of research into this. And it's basically because you're carrying the sort of emotional load of your team, which is, the way it kind of works. But you're not getting the same feedback, like the positive physiological feedback of like seeing someone smile in your face and actually being in their presence, that you would if, because you're working remotely. And all of those tiny little moments that you would have got aren't there. So people are having like almost like emotional drainage because they're having to facilitate hard conversations or emotionally support someone all remotely. And it really, especially if you're taking the model of servant leadership where you're trying to support everyone. And so what I would recommend for any leader in that position is ensuring you step away from the laptop, now and again, and definitely get your breaks, right? So step away from the laptop, look away from your desk, like even if it's for 2 minutes, it can make a huge difference. It's the ability to look into the far distance can help regulate your nervous system and like lower the vagal tone of your nervous system. So that's part one. Part two is also, you know, walking. So walking has been shown to actually help reduce the stresses and strains on your nervous system. So even if it's just a 5-minute walk around the block, even just walking up and down your apartment, or, you know, if you're working remotely and stuff, that, because what's happening is your eyes are taking in a wider peripheral view, whereas if you're on a laptop like we are right now, you're looking at one particular thing, so your brain is kind of focused on one aspect. So when you're walking, your eyes kind of just take in the sort of sights, and it just calms you down. So those are two really quick things any leader can do instantly. And then longer term, I think you need to make sure that you've got the structures in place to support your team, whilst also making sure that you've got the breaks and contingencies in place. You don't have to flog yourself to death. Like you said earlier, you're not doing everything as the team leader. You're not doing everything as the leader of the organization. You're empowering your team to like do the things they need to do. So equally, it should be a shared responsibility of achieving the goals. You're just the leader, and almost like the person who drives the ship or steers the ship. You don't drive a ship, but you steer a ship, so that you're all going in the right direction. So I think being able to manage your energy is super important, but really get tactical with your calendar invites. You know, do you really need all those meetings? Do you really need all the one-to-one touch points every single week? Probably not. So work out a structure that works for you, and make sure you do take those breaks, even if it's just as simple as looking out a window or walking up and down for a couple of minutes.
We should also say get support from clinical professionals when you feel you need it.
I would, no, absolutely. I think recognizing those things is really important as a person, as a leader, just as a person in general, whether you're leading a team or not. With this conversation, I think being able to recognize I don't feel great today, and understanding like what is it that I do need. So like I had that last week, I was like, gosh, I feel really, you know, like and what I needed was to go and hang out with my mum and dad, and just sort of watch telly and just chill out with them, have tea and biscuits and stuff like that. Because I'd actually been working remotely at home all week, and whilst I'd had a busy week and it had been good, I'd been on my own, like, and you know, subconsciously I guess my brain was like, you've been on your own all week. So it's, especially if you're working as a freelancer and you know you're working on your own most of the time, I think it's really important to recognize when you're feeling, or whatever the word is for you. I think I'm quite onomatopoeic with my sensations and feelings, but do take that time to recognize in yourself, like, I'm not feeling great, what can I do, you know, before it goes too far. If it's going further than that, totally and utterly go to a professional, reach out to a network, do a bit of reading, you know, find out what works for you. And also, if anyone is then going to go to therapy, also, you know, do try different ones. It's not a one size fits all kind of model. There's different types and modalities, and you might find that you need to try a few, a bit like dating, before you find the right one.
Absolutely. You know, mindful of time, and there are a couple more things I wanted to ask. I'll just say to those, great, I can see someone's already popped a question in the chat, but those who are listening live, if you do have any questions, get them ready. I'll come to you shortly. But one thing I did want to ask Ilona is, you've been very vocal, I guess the word is, on LinkedIn about what you're calling productivity paranoia. And last week we saw Microsoft release research that showed, while workers think they're being more productive at home, managers think they're more productive in the office. So it's that age-old dichotomy of you have to be in the office to be productive. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts around what's going on there with that sort of disconnect.
Yeah, two things sort of sprang to mind with this. And they're not the only two things that it could be, but I think there's two things to kind of consider. The first thing is managers and their employees. There's obviously a disconnect in the communication there, because that disparity between like 87%, I think, of workers feel they're being productive, and yet 17% of managers think it's working. I think there's a disconnect in communication. So what I would say to anyone, to their manager, because we're working in a remote world, no one can see what you're doing. You might need to then communicate what it is you've done. Not necessarily every day, I think that's a bit overkill, but maybe it's an update, it's a status update. So I think that's really helpful to the manager, just so they know where everything is. In a, you know, in an office environment, I guess they would see that there was something going on and just assume that it's all going well. I think it's just being super clear about the communication with your manager. So also it's kind of, I know in other terms it's called managing upwards, but I just call it communicating. Communicate what you're doing. Nobody's watching you, so you kind of just need to help your manager out and tell them, hey, this week I completed these tasks. Can you get, you know, can you help me out with this or that, the other? And just so they're aware. The other option is what I mentioned before about the structures in place. So did that manager put the structures in place so that they know what's going on with their team? So it's like a two-way street. And if they didn't put the structures in place, what structures can you put in place? So is it updating, as I said before, like it was almost like a team manifesto? Is it that? Is it that you need to be more outcomes focused? So, you know, you have a goal and target for a month or a quarter or whatever your, you know, way of working is. What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? And what are the milestones along that outcome that you're trying to get to? That's your structure. That's what you need to put in as a manager. It might not be like your role, it might be a project manager, but you need to understand what are the key milestones and how are you getting there? Because they're the two disconnects that are happening, I think, because otherwise they wouldn't feel that way. It would be the same. And equally, I wonder if there's people at home who, because they're worried because they're working from home and they're like, oh my goodness, does, you know, I've got to prove my worth because no one, you know, no, I'm not in the office. Maybe people think I'm not working. Are you working on the right thing? Because we've all been guilty of that, right? Of almost getting busy and creating work for ourselves. So that structure and communication piece needs to come together, because those people may be working on the wrong things and super busy, and the manager doesn't think that they're doing the things that they need to do to achieve the next thing that they need to do together.
Sure. So it's that alignment in objectives really to help alleviate the stress, the anxiety, even some of the loneliness of working from home, because you're actually talking to people. Yeah.
And the thing is, you've got to remember the technology isn't designed to facilitate that yet, right? The technology, you've got to remember, was designed like late 90s, early noughties, where we were working in a working world that was predominantly in the office. So a lot of the ways that we designed the software even was for that world. I imagine in 10 years' time, we almost might have like an augmented reality situation where you put on goggles and you're almost in a team environment and you can see what everyone's doing. I have no idea what the future might hold. Ask Web 3.0 or the metaverse, but understanding there is a gap between what that gap gives you feedback, right? That piece of information, those two statistics give you feedback, and it tells you that there is a disconnect. The disconnect is probably communication, and the ways to mitigate against communication are to create structures and places in which to communicate.
Absolutely. I can see there's one question coming to the chat already. Tracy, would you like to ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask on your behalf?
I'm quite happy to ask.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
You talked earlier, and it's really good advice in terms of how you communicate with people and making sure that you think about how they receive it more than anything. Some will be put off by a contact that says, you know, let's have a meeting, and may be frightened by it. And sometimes it will always, you know, I for example, I'm in HR. I quite often get that response. If I ask to meet with someone, they'll run for the hills. But outside of that, if my manager asks me, I don't go into panic mode. I try constructively to think about, okay, make sure I'm ready to meet with my manager. Think about all the things that I might want to talk to him about at the same time. But sometimes I might get a communication come through to me and I'm just not in the mood for it. And my manager is very keen on making sure he communicates in the right way. Just really want an idea. Is there anything that you are aware of or is successful if we try some digital platform to get either a smiley face or a miserable face or something in between on a daily basis from our staff, so that their managers know, don't approach me today, or today's a good day. You want to ask me? Ask me. I just didn't know whether you are aware of anything that has been successful, could be done?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tracy. I'm sure there's going to be now someone creating that platform from that idea, or if it's not already in motion. But I think that, like, whilst we're maybe waiting for the technology, it could be again one of those things that goes into that team contracting piece, especially like with your direct line reports or your direct manager. Like, what is the way in which we can communicate to each other that this is not a good day to kind of broach those topics? It could be as simple as sending an emoji, like doing almost like a classification of a team emoji, like this is what this means in terms of like, yep, I'm all good to go, or not today, thanks. I know, like, for example, on Slack, you can actually put your status, so you can have do not disturb, busy, etc. You could say, you know, on that status update, not contactable today, or something along those lines. I think you're right in being able to communicate that to people is great, so that they, you know, there again isn't that miscommunication. And I think there are a fair few good tools out there from a HR perspective in terms of creating surveys and under like almost short-term snap surveys. So they're almost like just click a button, how are you feeling today? I know there's those sorts of things which will almost push out an email, and you almost do that rating smiley face on how you're feeling today. I think they're called like pulse surveys. They can be quite good at measuring the temperature almost of your organisation and where people are feeling at the moment.
Yeah. Do you know of any that have been anything like that that's been successful, or from a digital perspective, do you think that they are
I think
worthy?
I think they can give you a good sense of the, as I say, the temperature of the organisation. I've seen that with Culture Amp and oh God, I can't remember the other one now, but there are lots of platforms that offer that. They usually are part of a HR tech solution, but use like customer, like a employee engagement tool, and then you can get a sense. But ultimately, that's just going to give you a snapshot on a day, right? And so, you know, on a day like today, for example, when the pound is disappearing into the ether, it might be a day when everyone's feeling a bit down, or like when the Queen passed away, or when it was a Queen's, you know, around the Queen's funeral, it could have been a down day. And it's actually nothing to do with the organisation, but it's to do with bigger world circumstances. So I think as well, it's good practice to keep an eye on what's going on in the wider world to kind of help you mitigate any risks to the well-being and mental health of your employees as well.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And I think, as you say, Ilona, someone is probably working on an app for that right now, Tracy, so keep an eye out. We'll yeah.
Definitely do check them out, and I have seen them work well in the past, but yeah, they're just part of employee engagement survey tools that I've found work quite well. The trick with them, if you're looking for them as well, is to make sure that they're very easy to do, because people find almost like survey fatigue, and that can then add into a problem of well-being. Like, I feel like I'm being surveyed too much. So if it's just almost like a like button or a happy face sort of smiley tick box, then you'd be better off.
Yeah, we had something not dissimilar actually in the office environment, but people just stopped using it because it just they got out of the habit. They didn't want to do it.
It is a bit as well.
Yeah. That is a danger, and all of the, I used to work in internal communications, and survey fatigue was a real thing even before the pandemic. So thanks for that, Tracy, and thanks, Ilona. I'm just mindful of time, so if I could maybe wrap it up by asking you one final question, if I can get my words out. Do you have any final thoughts or advice on being a leader in the digital age for our community?
Yes, I think the best one is to stay curious, so that, you know, nobody has the answer. I don't have the answer, nobody has the answer, but I think what's great is people are talking about things and we're trying to work out what works best. So stay curious and, you know, keep learning about what's going on, what are the latest practices, what's working, you know, what's the latest tools that could be quite useful for your organisation. I also have a podcast where I explore this in depth. The point of the podcast was, you know, the whole thing is to get that discussion going. It's called Still Loading because we're always still loading and we're always still trying to work out the best way to be a leader and to navigate, you know, the world of work, and definitely take that time to reflect on yourself, making sure that your well-being and mental health is, you know, your priority.
Awesome, thank you. And of course, Ilona is a consultant as well, so it would be remiss of us to not say you can always contact Ilona. We will share her contact details when we share the replay of this event, or you can find her on LinkedIn. You are in the community as well, actually, aren't you? Yeah, so
Yeah.
You can be DM'd if needed. But that just leads me to say thank you very much, Ilona, for your time. Thank you to those of you who have joined us live. Yeah, we will get this up in the community, and great to have you with us, Ilona.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who asked the questions and was here. And thank you very much for your questions. Really appreciate it.